New York, 1953. 14-year-old newspaper delivery boy Jimmy Bozart collects his weekly payments from the residents of a Brooklyn apartment building. One woman hands him a nickel as a tip. Jimmy takes it and immediately feels something is off. The coin is too light. He turns it over in his hand and accidentally drops it. The coin splits in half. Inside, there's a tiny sheet of microfilm, the size of a postage stamp, covered in dense columns of hundreds of numbers, neat rows without a single word. Jimmy shows his discovery to the police officer's daughter who lives upstairs. 2 days later, the information is on the FBI's desk. The country's best cryptographers begin their work. For 4 years, they try to crack the cipher. 4 years, nothing. This is because the code was created by a man who officially didn't exist. A man without a name, without a past, without a single record in American databases. He was a Soviet intelligence colonel who lived in Brooklyn disguised as a photographer and amateur artist. He spent 9 years in the heart of America, and during that time, he transmitted atomic secrets, military plans, and the names of agents to Moscow, changing the course of the Cold War. His name was William Fisher, but the world knows him by the name he invented at the moment of his arrest, Rudolf Abel. This is the story of how one man single-handedly held the world's most guarded country in his sights. But first, how he got there, and why American intelligence had no idea who he was. When he crossed the American border in November 1948 with a forged Canadian passport, he carried a legend in his pocket. Not just documents, but an entire biography of a fictitious person cultivated in the NKVD archives over many years. He entered as Andrew Chaotis, a Lithuanian-American citizen. The real Chaotis had existed. The real Chaotis had conveniently and quietly died in a Soviet hospital, leaving behind clean documents. But this identity was temporary. Within a few months, Chaotis disappeared, and in his place appeared Emil Goldfuss, a quiet, pleasant, middle-aged man, a photographer, and a bit of an artist. He rented a studio in Brooklyn on Fulton Street, paying rent in cash, on time, without question. With neighbors, he talked about painting and the weather. No women, no parties, no noise. The ideal neighbor. But what happened behind the closed door of that studio changes everything. The photo lab was officially for his work, but unofficially for producing microdots. This technology, which Nazi intelligence had invented during World War II, involved photographically reducing secret text to the size of a period at the end of a sentence. Such a dot could be hidden under a postage stamp, in a newspaper article, or in a letter on a magazine cover. It was invisible to the naked eye, and couldn't be found by accident. Abel transformed his studio into a small production facility. He photographed documents, reduced the images, and sealed them into microdots. Then, these dots went out into the world. In letters, packages, and newspapers he left at prearranged dead drops. Working with hollow objects was his signature style. Hollow coins, nickels that looked no different from ordinary ones, hollow bolts, hollow pencils, hollow shoe heels. Inside each was a rolled-up strip of microfilm or a tiny note with a digital code. It was one of these coins that ended up in Jimmy Bozart's hands. Someone in the agent network made a mistake, handing over an operational coin instead of a real one. This was the first crack, but his arrest was still 5 years away. And while the FBI puzzled over the coin for 4 years, Abel worked calmly. Here's what he was transmitting to Moscow, and why it was so dangerous. Abel never rushed. This was his guiding principle. The KGB instilled in him a belief he repeated to his agents again and again. The most dangerous moment in an illegal's work is not surveillance or arrest, but haste. He could go weeks without contacting Moscow. He could go months without contacting agents. He lived by a strict rhythm: studio, walk, cafe, books. A retired artist. Nothing remarkable. In his studio, paintings, his own oil creations, hung on the walls. Portraits, landscapes, abstracts. Among New York's bohemian circles, he was known as a talented amateur. He was invited to exhibitions, offered wine, and asked if he considered showing his work to gallery owners. Abel politely declined because gallery owners ask questions. They ask about one's past, art schools, teachers, and Emil Goldfuss had no verifiable past. Now let's discuss why he was even there, because what he transmitted to Moscow literally changed the world order. In 1949, the US had just conducted its first hydrogen bomb test. Washington estimated the Soviet Union was 10, even 15 years behind. American intelligence was confident that the USSR lacked the technology, resources, or scientists to create its own nuclear weapons in the foreseeable future. In August of that same year, the USSR detonated its own atomic bomb. Washington was in a panic. How? From where? It's impossible. It was possible. Because for several years, a Soviet intelligence network in the United States had methodically siphoned everything from the American nuclear project: blueprints, calculations, test protocols, and the names of scientists. Able arrived in New York precisely to keep this network operational, to recruit, create new channels, and ensure the secure transmission of information. His main asset was an extensive network of agents, the so-called volunteers. These were people who worked not for money, but for an idea. They were American citizens, convinced communists, who sincerely believed they were making the world a better place by transmitting their country's secrets to Soviet intelligence. Among them were Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. They would be arrested in 1950 and executed in the electric chair in 1953. Abel, by then, would be completely underground, leaving no single thread that could lead back to him. But how exactly did he recruit people? That's a separate science, and it's far darker than it seems. Abel never approached a potential agent directly. He never revealed his true identity, never offered money, never pressured. For months, he would study a person, their weaknesses, beliefs, financial situation, family problems. He looked for an entry point. Sometimes it was ideology, sometimes debt, sometimes simple vanity. The feeling of being part of something big, secret, and important. He was a skilled listener. This was his main recruitment skill, not to persuade, but to listen, to let a person talk, to remember everything, and then, at the right moment, to say exactly what that person wanted to hear. One of his handlers in Moscow would later write in a report, "Fisher possessed a quality extremely rare for an intelligence officer. He never rushed events. He could wait for years. And he always waited for his moment." But what Abel didn't know, and this nearly cost him his life prematurely, was that there was a bomb within his own team. In his team was a man named Reino Heihanen, Finnish by origin, a Soviet citizen by passport, and a liaison agent by position. The KGB sent him to New York in 1952 as Abel's assistant. Heihanen was a disaster in human form. He drank heavily, gambled away operational money, and had an affair with an American woman, which was strictly forbidden by the rules of illegal work. Once, he lost a large sum of cash meant for agent payments. Another time, he forgot the location of a dead drop with secret documents. Abel wrote to Moscow, "Remove him. This man is a threat. Heihanen is a ticking time bomb." Moscow hesitated. In 1957, Heihanen was recalled to the USSR, ostensibly for a reprimand, and perhaps for something worse. He boarded a ship to Europe, but in Paris, he disembarked and went to the American embassy. And he told everything. Every meeting point, every alias, every dead drop location in New York. On June 21, 1957, FBI agents knocked on the door of room 839 at the Latham Hotel on 28th Street in Manhattan. Behind the door was an elderly man in pajamas. He calmly opened it, calmly looked at their badges, and calmly said, "Well then, come in." And now, the moment that turned Abel into a legend. What he did immediately upon his arrest changed everything. During the arrest, FBI agents, following standard procedure, asked for his name. He could have remained silent. He had the right to. He could have called himself Goldfuss. That was the name on his documents. He could have called himself Coyotes. He could have made up anything. Instead, he gave the name of a real Soviet intelligence officer who had died several years earlier, Rudolf Ivanovich Abel. Why? The KGB would later reconstruct this moment and conclude, Fisher did it intentionally. By naming a dead Soviet officer, he sent a signal to Moscow. I am arrested. I am not broken. I gave a name you know. Identify me. Take care of me. Don't abandon me. It was a coded cry for help, spoken aloud, directly to the American agents. And they understood nothing. What the FBI found in his room was astounding. Even the agents couldn't believe their eyes. A radio transmitter, disassembled and hidden in a suitcase with a false bottom. Cipher pads, one-time sheets with codes that were destroyed immediately after use. Hollow pencils, several hollow bolts, brushes and paints. Genuine, he really did paint. And a wooden palette for mixing paints with a hollowed-out secret compartment inside. Artist, photographer, spy. All three roles were absolutely genuine. FBI investigators would later admit they had never before seen such a level of operational skill. Every item in the room had a dual purpose. Every detail of his legend was meticulously crafted. There wasn't a single document, not a single record that directly pointed to Soviet intelligence. If not for Heihanen, they would never have found him. At the trial, something happened that no one expected, not even his own lawyer. Abel declined a state-appointed attorney. He was assigned James Donovan, an experienced lawyer and former intelligence officer. Donovan was stunned by his client. Abel did not ask for leniency. He did not try to make a deal. He did not offer information in exchange for a reduced sentence. He sat in the defendant's box in a worn jacket, observing the proceedings with interest, as if it were not his life on trial, but an amusing legal precedent. Donovan would later write in his memoirs, "In all my career, I had never met a man with such absolute self-possession. He was not afraid, not at all. It was almost frightening." Abel was sentenced to 32 years in prison. He listened to the verdict. He nodded. He asked for permission to continue painting in his cell. Permission was granted. And this is where perhaps the strangest part of this story begins, how a person behaves when they have nothing left to lose. In prison, Abel behaved just as he had in freedom, quietly, methodically, and incomprehensibly. He drew portraits of his cellmates. He helped illiterate inmates write letters home. He studied Spanish, for pleasure, as he explained. He solved mathematical problems. He read voraciously. The prison psychologist wrote in a report, "Inmate Goldfuss demonstrates exceptional psychological resilience, absence of anxiety, complete acceptance of the situation. Additional observation is recommended, as this behavior is atypical." Atypical. A man facing life imprisonment in a foreign country behaved as if he had come to a resort and merely overstayed his welcome. Meanwhile, Donovan didn't give up. He convinced the court not to sentence Abel to death, arguing that a living Soviet spy might one day be useful for an exchange. It was a far-sighted argument, and it worked. In 1960, history took a turn no one had planned, and Abel was once again at the center. In May 1960, a US U-2 spy plane was shot down over the Soviet Union. The pilot, Francis Gary Powers, ejected and was captured alive. Soviet propaganda triumphed. Khrushchev personally announced the arrest of the American spy. Now, both sides had cards to play. February 10th, 1962. The Glienicke Bridge on the border between West Berlin and East Germany. The bridge that would later be known as the Bridge of Spies. From one side walked Powers, from the other, Abel. They passed each other in the middle of the bridge, not looking. Donovan stood aside and watched. He would later write, "Abel walked as if returning from a stroll. No excitement, no tears, just the quiet, calm stride of a man who had done everything right. And now, the main question, why him? Why is Abel, and not someone else, considered the best illegal intelligence officer in history? Not because he obtained the most secrets, and not because he recruited the most agents, but because he lived for 9 years in the most dangerous place on earth, in the heart of American counterintelligence, in New York, during the era of the harshest anti-communist paranoia in U.S. history, during the McCarthy years, when people were jailed for mere suspicion of sympathy for the USSR. And he never once made a mistake. He was caught, not because he stumbled. He was caught by a traitor. This is a fundamental difference. In the professional intelligence community, there's an unwritten rule. An illegal who wasn't broken by the enemy is called undefeated. Abel went through arrest, trial, and prison, and he didn't name a single person. He didn't reveal a single dead drop. He didn't confirm a single fact that the Americans didn't already know from Heihanen. The FBI interrogated him for many months. The best investigators, experienced psychologists, pressure, isolation, persuasion, nothing. He smiled, pretended not to understand the question, and asked for another cup of coffee. In Moscow, he was greeted as a hero. But what he did next was more important than any awards. The Order of Lenin, the Order of the Red Banner, his third. A personal audience with the chairman of the KGB. Then, teaching. Abel became an instructor for the next generation of illegals. He passed on what couldn't be written in a textbook: how to think like a local, how to kill an accent not only in speech, but also in gestures, in facial expressions, in the way you hold a fork and look at a stranger on the subway. They say he told cadets one story again and again about how, in his first months in New York, he was riding the subway and accidentally made eye contact with a stranger. The man looked at him a little longer than usual. 3 seconds. Maybe 4. An ordinary person would have forgotten about it a minute later. Abel got off at the next station, changed his route, altered his plans for the day, and didn't leave his studio for 3 days. Paranoia is a professional skill, he told the cadets. Not a disease, a tool. Anyone who isn't paranoid at the right moments doesn't survive. He died in 1971 from lung cancer. He was 68 years old. Only family and a few close colleagues attended the funeral. No public ceremony, no speeches on television. Soviet newspapers published a short, 2-line obituary. The man who had been invisible his entire life remained invisible even after death. His file is still classified mostly. The American part, FBI materials, was declassified in the 2000s. Thousands of pages reveal one thing. The agents who interrogated him eventually wrote a report with a phrase unusual for a bureaucratic document. They called him the most competent foreign agent we had ever encountered. Abel's story is not just a spy story. It's a story of how far a person who knows how to wait can go. Most people who betray their countries do so out of greed, fear, or resentment. They want quick money, quick results, quick recognition. Abel never wanted anything quickly. He was willing to spend years building a legend brick by brick. He was willing to go months without contacting Moscow, simply because the moment wasn't right. He was willing to live in a foreign country under a false name, without the right to call his wife, write to his daughter, or tell anyone the truth about himself. And when everything collapsed, he was ready to sit in an American prison and wait, calmly, patiently, with a pencil and sketchbook, until history took its next turn. It did. It always does. The coin Jimmy Bozart found in 1953 is now preserved in the FBI Museum in Washington. A small nickel disc split into 2 halves. Inside, emptiness. Exactly as Abel's entire life was to those looking from the outside. A quiet artist, a pleasant neighbor, a lover of coffee and painting. The man named Emil Goldfuss did not exist. But William Fisher did, and he changed the world while no one was watching.